Good afternoon. I want to talk really quickly about the Russia-Ukraine status. It's getting to the point where it's almost inauguration season, which means the Western media can almost start being honest about what's going on in Ukraine. It's not going well, and we'll get into that in a moment, but our involvement with Russia is more complicated and more lengthy than most people really understand. It's not just the recent events, it's not just the Cold War. It goes all the way back to John Quincy Adams and the Alaska ownership by Russia. But when John Quincy Adams, by the time he became president, the sixth president, his political and diplomatic career had already had a lot of experience in the War of 1812 and his befriending of Tsar Alexander First in Russia. The Monroe Doctrine, which he helped craft. The Monroe Doctrine is basically what told everybody else, okay, we won the War of 1812, therefore you guys can't be involved anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Europe, you stay out. Europe, stay out of this area. It doesn't matter what interest you might have or negotiations you want with sovereign nations in South and Central America. You just stay out because we're America. They probably pounded their chest at the same time, too. Well, that lasted for a while, but MacKinder's Heartland Thesis is not going to be denied. So it is decision time for Russia. Now, getting on with this war business, the Atlantic is helpfully pointing out that, yeah, things aren't going so well. And, of course, it's Trump's fault. Trump is facing a catastrophic defeat in Ukraine. If Ukraine falls. If. Okay, it'll be hard to spin as anything but a debacle for the U.S. and for its president. Thank you, Robert Kagan. How convenient. I thought it already was a debacle, but let's move on. The sixth president of the United States, John Quincy Adams, was also the minister of Russia, not the first minister of Russia, but he was appointed by James Madison to be minister of Russia because he had such a good education and multilingual capacity. He was the son of John Adams, and his mom helped educate him. And by 7 years old, he was already pretty much the man of the house, as John Adams was sent to Philadelphia to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he had to sort of pick up his bootstraps and fend for himself, and eventually he got sent over to Europe to get educated. It's all very well documented in communications back and forth between himself, his mother, and John Adams. But you can go to the Massachusetts Historical Society and look that up yourself. But by the time he was 14 years old, he was over there accompanying Francis Dana, the first minister to Russia, in the court of Catherine the Great. Although he didn't actually meet Catherine the Great, neither did Francis Dana. There was a diplomatic delegation. Francis Dana, this man here, was a great role model for John Quincy Adams, who eventually became the minister to Russia himself. And as I mentioned, by that time, Alexander I was in charge of Russia. Catherine the Great had gone away, and Paul was murdered after her. He was replaced by Alexander I. And Adams continued to favor Russian neutrality between France and Britain during the Napoleonic War. From his diplomatic post, Adams observed the French Emperor Napoleon's invasion of Russia, which ended in defeat for the French, as it did later for the Nazis, as it did just now for the Ukrainians on behalf of NATO, aka America. I don't know how much farther we want to push this nonsense, but I don't imagine it's going to get any easier. It's kind of what MacKinder was talking about with respect to the Heartland. I'll talk about that in a second. But while he was there, initially, John Quincy Adams didn't have a very positive impression about Russia. This is from a historical center going over the early years of his life at UVA. Shortly after the loss of Tennessee, President James Madison appointed Adams as the first minister. That's not correct. He was the second minister of Russia, although Adams had previously expressed negative feelings about Russia as a nation of slaves and princes. Kind of sounds like a gas station with nukes, right? He soon developed a strong personal attachment to the Tsar Alexander, whom he admired for his willingness to stand up to Napoleon. Well, we don't have a third party here except China, which I guess Trump is going to try to make them the Napoleon and drive between Russia. Who knows? We'll see how that works out. While in Russia, Adams persuaded the Tsar to allow American ships to trade in Russian ports, and when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, Adams' dispatches home provided President Madison with detailed and perceptive accounts of the war. So you see, we acknowledge that Russia had interests back then. We don't do that anymore. This is Alexander I and highlighting his perspective here. But this time, Alexander was a Russian nationalist and a Slavophile who wanted Russia to develop on the basis of Russian culture rather than European. Well, he probably got tired of getting slapped in the face, even though the language of diplomacy was French, and that's how John Quincy Adams really got his start. Was he was such a polyglot. He spoke French, he knew Latin and Russian. I think he knew Russian, but he definitely knew French, and that was the language of diplomacy back then. They're not speaking French in diplomacy anymore. In fact, Putin is speaking Russian. He's letting somebody else translate it for him. And it's English for now, but I don't know that they really need to worry about what the French think. They don't really need to worry too much about what the Americans think by the way things are going. Do they need to worry about what the Europeans think? Well, this is the pivot I'm talking about. Now, getting to the Heartland theory. I've talked about this before in a previous video, but MacKinder's Heartland Thesis. This is the heartland up here in Russia. The rimland is out here, and yes, you can see Europe's part of it, but they're not nearly as relevant a part as they once were. It's much more relevant over here in China. Meanwhile, the periphery islands, that'd be America. Sure, we were powerful after World War II because everybody else was pretty much obliterated or not yet developed, but as you can see, things are changing and much more developed. Now, this part here of the rimland is very significant. Let me show you why. Yushi, China. Right there, this following little clip from a video I'm going to show you demonstrates that Yushi, China is where, within a 6-hour plane ride, 50% of the population lives. So if you want to be a businessman, you want to be successful, you want to be where the action is, it's going to be around this area here. So Russia, resources, China, manufacturing, know-how, whatever else. Together you can see where this is going. Anyway, for an explanation, here's my favorite channel over here, Inside China Business.
It means that half the population of the planet is within a 6-hour plane ride of Kunming International Airport. It means that you can set up an office in this part of the world right here and be able to sell products and services to over 4 billion people. The other half of the world is spread out over Europe, Australia, Africa, North America, South America. But most of them are right here in this little circle.
So the Monroe Doctrine is not nearly as significant as it was, and even so, can we really stop Brazil from joining BRICS? I mean, I don't know how many coups you have to fund down in Central and South America, but if all the action is happening over here, does that even matter?
So the next...
And do they have any money is the other question.
If you are a manager...
By the way, consumer up here, $12 a day. That's what makes a consumer. That's a lot of money for spending every day in India right now, but in the not too distant future, maybe not.
Or an executive at a young, growing company. You need to find products and services that appeal to these 4+ billion people.
And aside from social media, America really doesn't have that. And that's going to change too. China and Russia, they want their own platforms. They don't really want a U.S. platform where you have the CEO in the Oval Office.
The biggest U.S. companies are trying to figure out how to do that. Now we see that the biggest German companies are trying to figure out how to do that.
If the Germans are trying to figure it out, that's out of desperation. We're not letting them figure it out. We're too busy blowing up their energy sources.
Why? Let's look at this chart again. So Germany will grow 0% between now and 2030. UK up 3, France...
0% growth for Germany. 0. That's terrible.
It's up 3, Italy down 1. That's Europe. So if you're a big German company trying to figure out how to get through the next 10 years, where are you going to invest most of your money?
Don't forget, Germany is the glue holding the EU together, as well as NATO. If they pull out of NATO, that's it.
In Europe or in Asia? Well, now we know. They don't think it's Europe.
They don't think it's Europe because it's not Europe. And from a political perspective, this is something that people tend to forget.
Whomever you like between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I can tell you one thing with cosmic metaphysical certainty, which is that they will both be dead in 20 years. They won't be in government. They won't be anywhere.
They'll be in the ground.
They'll be gone. In 20 years, there are 4 billion Asians who are going to have a lot more money to spend than they've got right now. And if your company isn't here, then you'll be dead too.
So yeah, Russia has to think about where to go. Now, are they going to keep trying to be European? I don't think so. I think that decision's already been made, actually. They keep getting slapped in the face. They're not being allowed to participate over here. It just makes sense. The pivot of history is happening and might not be in the center right here. Maybe it's down over here somewhere, but it's not in Europe. Which way, Russian man? Thanks for watching.